Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the second day of the Slave Dwelling Project. My name is Teresa Lee, and this morning I am here with Carroll Van West, the director of the MTSU, Historical Preservation Society. I'm sure I just messed that up. My apologies. I will let you introduce yourself. And you are going to talk about, your presentation is from documentation to activism. Listening and acting at the MTSU Center for Historic Preservation. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I will exit and send it over to you.
Thank you, Teresa, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this panel today as we sort of talk about the academic world and what is happening in African American preservation and in preservation in general. As many of you know, 3 years ago, the MTSU Center for Historic Preservation served as the host and sponsor for the 5th annual Slave Dwelling Project Conference. For those of you able to attend, you know, it was quite the event. We were able to convince Colson Whitehead. At that time, his book Underground Railroad was, riding the charts, and people were talking about that book. This is long before it was turned into the series on Amazon Prime. And it was a great keynote by Colson White. We also had the Fifth Jubilee Singers doing a special concert for those who attended. But of course, the heart of that conference were presentations just like you're getting this week from Clemson University, where new ideas were presented, people discussed, a lot of good ideas were exchanged. I thought it was one of the best conferences, certainly we have ever sponsored in our time, but I think it was a conference also very much of its time, because you think of where we were in 2018, particularly the fall of 2018, and there were many different issues on the table. Of course, in Tennessee, after that conference, began the very slow process of taking down Confederate monuments. This is the location of what had been the statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest in the heart of Memphis, in what was then known as Forest Park. That statue was removed about a year after the conference, and it is now someplace else, but it's out of. That was the beginning of a long process in Tennessee, and of course across the nation. Many other communities in many other states reconsidering what the public landscape was like and what that said to all of the different citizens of this nation. And that debate, of course, still goes on. It's still a centered way of thinking so much on white privilege. It's interesting in so many of these debates, we have to be careful not to insult the feelings of those who want to support the Confederacy, or at least the memory of the Confederacy or the history of the Confederacy. This notion of white privilege, though, is not just in the popular culture and across different heritage groups in the nation. It's also still very much within universities that we go to for education, inspiration, and new ideas. And this is really what I wanted to talk some about today. I've been in this process, as many of you know, for a long time. And what increasingly bothers me is this idea that we're doing history on a group or on a community or on a neighborhood. Instead of what we should be thinking is, we're out there doing projects. We're trying to teach that next generation how to work with the community and for a community, taking a neighborhood's goals, understanding those, and helping them achieve those goals. It's sort of flipping the script in some ways. And I know many of you are saying, well, yeah, we do that ourselves. That's not the big issue that maybe you think. But I would are you au contraire? Because these are stories that have been in the newspapers of the England and the United States over the past year. This isn't something pre Charlottesville or something right after Charlottesville. This is in the news today. The teaching of an online course with the bones of a young woman murdered when the Philadelphia police attacked the Muse neighborhood in the mid 1970s. And it was like, well, you know, we just didn't know. It was sort of interesting to read those stories where suddenly the buck was being passed from one place to the other. Well, we didn't know. We didn't know the provenance. And of course, the descendants, and in this case, one of the mothers of the child who died in this horrendous attack, you know, she wasn't informed. She didn't know. And what a terrible way to learn that the bones of your child are being used in this fashion. But, you know, it's not just on the East Coast, it's also on the West Coast, where a scientist associated with the Caltech decided, well, he wanted to teach students and do some research in geology. So we'll just go out and drive holes into a rock so we can study that rock. And oh, by the way, there's prehistoric art there, and that's actually a sacred site to Native Americans today. Well, you know, I'm sorry about that, but, you know, we had to pursue our science. So sometimes those of us in the academy are so tied up in what we do and what we understand, we don't often think about how it plays out to those of us, to everyone else around us. And I think this is a problem that we have to keep in mind. And of course, all of my friends out west among the different tribes would say, well, we've been dealing with this issue, of course, forever. So every time we think we turn a corner, we realize that we still have a long road to go. And really listening to those on the margins, those who have been silenced in the past, those who have been ignored, and working with them, finding out what they want to do and moving forward. This may became most graphically, to my mind, with the recent news in the field of material culture that one of the decorative pots produced by Dave the Potter, his last name has never been really identified that everyone is comfortable, but he's been known for several decades now by his work. He signed his work Dave, and he was an enslaved person working in the Edgefield district of South Carolina. And his pots were always valued, but now suddenly the prices have skyrocketed to the point that museums, and in this case, there were 3 different museums bidding on the piece before you, paid a record amount because, well, they want that piece from an enslaved person in their collection. But then it raises the question, if we're going to invest that kind of money, why aren't we also investing money into the actual place where Dave worked in the Edgefield district? Now, full kudos to the state of South Carolina that owns this property and protects this property. But it is a place that probably needs a lot of money to be developed into a state historic site, so the work of these enslaved craftspeople can be better understood and better celebrated, not just by selling, you know, spectacular pieces of pottery and then having to go to major museums to see them. You know, we need to do things where the events happened and also involve the descendants of those same craftspeople who live in that area today. So there's a lot of issues that still remain. And what I would like to share with you today is what we've been trying to do at the MTSU Center for Historic Preservation on these issues and what we have learned. I mean, this has been a long road for us. It really began in the mid 1990s, about 25, 26 years ago, when a request came from the Woodlawn Baptist Church in Nutbush, Tennessee. The state of Tennessee received this request. They thought, we don't know what we can really do with this request, that this church should be listed in the National Register of Historic Places. And it was like, okay, you guys are, you seem to have some inroads here. You seem to know some things. Why don't you do this? And then right after this project, we unfortunately had a series of church burnings by the KKK in rural West Tennessee, where this church is. And the state also got concerned about that because, well, we really don't, we need to know more about this period in our history and this type of building. So the center began a project that really sort of transformed it, the Rural African American Church Survey. And this was a case where we didn't know much of anything. No one else knew much. There were published books, there were studies, but again, on the ground, you didn't know much. And what we learned was you go to the churches, you meet with the congregations, and you sit there and listen. And you listen to what they know of their history, what they want to share of their history. You might have to do multiple visits because why should they share their history with you? You certainly had never given them any attention in the past. Why now? It wasn't something they needed to do. It was something very much we needed to do to understand this whole side of the state's history. And it was a revolutionary, transformative event for the Center for Historic Preservation. I had already published a well-received book about the state's historic landscape. Well, I realized that after this work, well, that book was sort of limited because it really didn't get into the side of the state's history that had been silenced, and particularly sort of stays out of sight, because if they stayed out of sight and out of mind, they could be in a safe place. They could maybe not have their church burned or vandalized. So this type of comprehensive survey, really sort of changed our practice and changed our understanding. It was crucial when we were then asked by the Birmingham Historical Society and the city of Birmingham to work with them on the civil rights history of the city and to come to grips with that, and also come up with a overall study that would identify the many different churches in Birmingham that had been involved with the civil rights movement and which ones should be listed in the National Register of Historic Places. This Birmingham Civil Rights Multiple Property Nomination, as it's called in historic preservation jargon, was another step of really sort of opening up our minds on how you think about these historic sites and how do you learn about them, because they're not in standard histories. They're not covered much in the white dominated newspapers. There was a Birmingham newspaper that was run by African Americans, the Birmingham World. That was your one source, but all of these other sources tended to sort of ignore these buildings. So again, you learn by going and meeting with congregations and listening carefully to their traditions, their stories, and then what they thought was particularly important about the civil rights movement in Birmingham. And that went against the standard narrative of the day that it was, a top-down type movement. No, instead, it was very much a church-generated movement involving some 30 different churches across the city. And, this was fundamental to our understanding of the events and also centering these congregations into that narrative. Now, ever since then, whenever I have classes out doing work, like I did a summer class for the University of Virginia with the Museum of Southern Decorative Arts for several years last decade. And, going to these churches where they're located, as you can see here in Washington, Georgia, with Jackson Chapel AME Church, right across the railroad tracks in their own separate part of town, helping students understand the silences that were in the standard narrative about this community and its Black history could be learned by going into that community, listening carefully, finding out what they felt was important and what they maybe wanted assistance with in the realm of historic preservation and public history. Now, we went from churches into the blues music history of the Mississippi Delta in the 2006-2007 time period. This is a survey that we did with the Mississippi Blues Commission, also working with the Mississippi Division of Archives and History. And one of our goals was, and the Blues Commission wanted to find, where are the places where actually blues music generated and blues music were centered within African American neighborhoods. And again, once we launched into this project, talked with folks, met with folks, not only did we see fascinating places across the Delta, but then families started to pull photos out of their houses to share with us about the events that happened in these clubs, such as in Leland, Mississippi. And this exchange of ideas, exchange of evidence, and growing trust among the groups, I think were particularly important for us. And again, I think shined a totally different light on the blues music experience in Mississippi than what we had had before. So again, as we sometimes use the phrase, it was feet on the streets, but then working with existing political leadership in these towns, civic leaders, church leaders, educators, because you have to build up trust. They have to realize, oh, they're just not taking information from us. They're coming back with ways that they can assist us and help us tell our story, because that's what groups want to do throughout the country, I believe. They want the means to tell their stories, and we should keep in mind that our role is to not take the stories and tell them. Our role should be to serve those communities and allow and come up with mechanisms where they can tell their stories, and then that be shared as they wish for it to be shared. Nowhere is that more important with the story of the U.S. Public Health Service Syphilis Study that took place in Macon County, Alabama, from the 1930s to the 1970s. Now, in popular language, this is always called the Tuskegee Study, which I think is a misnomer, and I think it's deliberate. They call it Tuskegee to somehow link that famous African American institute to the study. Tuskegee did not design this study. Tuskegee did not carry out this study. The U.S. Public Health Service did. And they used Tuskegee facilities for some of the examination of the victims because, well, it was a segregated world. They couldn't take these African American victims to a white institution or a white space. They had to use Tuskegee. So, anytime you hear of this as the Tuskegee study, keep in mind that sort of shorthand. It was really the U.S. Public Health Service. And the goal of the study was to take a group of African American men, 600 of them, tell them that you're being tested and treated for bad blood, but actually they just wanted to monitor these men throughout their entire lifetimes and then conduct autopsies on them when they died. It was like an experiment that we'll keep these people, we want to monitor them and keep them alive. And they're really of no scientific value to us until they die, and we can do autopsies and see what was the effect of untreated syphilis on them over the long term. You know, it's one of the most gruesome chapters in our nation's history, and certainly in our nation's medical history. Well, I was brought into this in ways that I first didn't really expect. I'd had a request from the lady that you can see there in the photo, Elizabeth Sims, to come and look at a Rosenwald school that she wanted to preserve. She had already been talking some with Auburn University and with Tuskegee University, but she sort of relied on our expertise with nominating Rosenwald schools to the National Register of Historic Places. We had started working on the Rosenwald schools as a property type in a place of, you know, certain National Register interest in the early 1990s. So I came to meet with her, and we met at the church next door to the school that you can see there on the left, the Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church. And Mrs. Sims, during that conversation, just mentioned, well, you know, the big tree outside there, that's where the men of this community in Notasulga, Alabama, would wait for that Nurse Rivers to come and take blood from them during the Tuskegee study. And I went, whoa, wait a second. That's a very important story. How do you feel about it? Well, suddenly, Mrs. Sims and other members of the congregation were like, well, you know, they're pretty upset. They're pretty angry still today, some 30 years after the process had stopped. So we began to talk about that and what should be the steps. And they were like, we know where these victims are buried. We know where some of the, what the Public Health Service called the roundup places were. You know, that's a story that we think needs to be told from our vantage point as the families, where the events took place, not by the museum that's at Tuskegee University. They had nothing against the museum, but they felt that only told the sort of professional side of the story, not the impact that the study had in the actual neighborhoods of this rural Alabama county. So here's some more of the descendants of the victims. They were also very active in the preservation of the Rosenwald School. That became one project being guided by these women that you see here. We then used the school to tell their story. These panels that we have about the Public Health Service Syphilis Study, certainly we drafted language because we're used to doing exhibit text, but then every word of it was vetted by this group. If they wanted some other way of looking at it or talking about it, this was ongoing discussion over several months before we ended up creating the panels, and particularly the exhibit cases that you see here. The large black and white photograph is of Charlie Pollard, who was the grandfather of Elizabeth Sims. So she had a direct story, a direct connection to one of the main figures in the story, who started to tell what happened to him in this long interview in Ebony magazine in the mid-1970s. So this was another project that not only changed our perception of what this syphilis study had meant, but it also impacted other medical historians. I know one who had been involved with the process and has written quite a bit about it said, well, you found connections and you found things that I never knew about. And we only knew that because the community themselves shared that with us. And when the museum opened, it had a huge turnout of people. They even had local TV coverage from Auburn, Alabama, and Montgomery, Alabama. And they were real pleased with how the school being restored could then become a backdrop not only for the school story, but for this truly important national story in medical history. Now, we also worked with the Creekstand AME Zion Church, because that's another cemetery where about a dozen victims are buried. It's in a very rural part of this county. It's off any of the paved roads onto a dirt road. And Sherry Williams was a congregant who was crucial in sort of bringing us in, working with us, working with the congregation, and allowing us to learn from them. And then in return, we prepared the National Register nomination for the cemetery. So this type of, again, exchange where we're providing expertise to these projects at no cost. All of this is pro bono work. We have great support from our university administration. And when we need additional funding, it's easy to go to certain donors for that funding to just support the travel, the time of the graduate students, the publication of the panels, whatever is needed, because people understand this is very important work and we want to be involved. And I never feel that these communities and neighborhoods should be asked to donate a penny to it, in that that's our sort of role. They're sharing their story. We need to, in return, give them something that they want and that they can use to tell their stories within their communities. So this is a view of the Creekstand AME Zion Cemetery. Again, some of the documentation work that our students learn immensely from this. And the Macon County project led into our work in Selma, Alabama, where again, it was much like Birmingham. There were two churches and a bridge that everyone was focused on in Selma, and that told the civil rights story. But then when you started to work with neighborhood groups, individuals and churches, educators, the fuller story comes out. And that was, again, it was a movement sustained over 100 years, not just in a few months in 1965. And it involved many different institutions, and in fact involved institutions across the town. The Tabernacle Baptist Church is now recognized as a National Historic Landmark. That came out of the multiple property study we did for these different groups in Selma, Alabama, with the support of the Alabama Historical Commission. Another key property in this neighborhood was the Jackson House. And today the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan Jackson, who let their house become a headquarters for all of the Selma events in 1964 and 65. She has worked with us now for several years, taking this National Register property, which is now a National Historic Landmark, and getting a handle on collections management, allowing her and her group of volunteer guides to tell the story of the property to individuals, tour groups, a lot of students who come to see this very, it's a totally intact environment. And you can see Mrs. Joanna Jackson there on the right, guiding a group through the building. We're also just have submitted the National Register nomination for yet another landmark within the neighborhoods of Selma to the civil rights movement. And again, this is one of the properties that helped to tell the story from 1900 to actually 1980. And that's the Burrell Dinkins House. That nomination just went forth. And again, on all of these, we're working directly with the property owners. We're trying to meet their needs, The Jackson House has been converted into a historic site, and the Dinkins family hopes to do the same with this building in downtown Selma. And this is a view of the interior. Again, it's an intact environment of a prominent family in the African American community of Selma, with everything sort of there from the last 100 years. It's just like a time capsule. And what a glorious opportunity it was for us to work with the family and to understand this house and its collections so much better. And I mean, I can't thank these different communities enough for what they allow us to work with them on and to gain a better understanding of Southern history and the history of the United States. We are doing a lot of work with cemeteries, and in Selma, we're now coming back around and working with the Elmwood Cemetery. City officials, descendants, people interested in the preservation of this African American cemetery. And we're doing a lot of different cemetery projects across the region. For example, one of these is related to work that began in Chattanooga in 2015. And this was because you had road plans aimed for a historic African American park, Lincoln Park in Chattanooga. And the neighborhood association, the Lincoln Park Neighborhood Association, had asked different people for help and, had really been given the cold shoulder. Nothing there is eligible for the National Register. Nothing much can happen. We're going to build this road. Well, there is Mrs. Rankins in the middle of a group that showed up when I accepted her invitation to come look at the neighborhood, to look at the park and talk about next steps. Now, Tiffany Rankin is someone that you just totally respect for what she devoted to her neighborhood and her story. And some of you might know I'm also the Tennessee state historian. So one thing I do find out that when I show up in a community, suddenly get a lot of people who maybe in the past didn't want to be interested, but I'm there and they show up to see what I might say. So you see Mrs. Rankin here surrounded by white people. And she told me later, well, that was okay. I knew if I could get you here, the white people would probably come. So that was part of her deliberate strategy. And as we, talked with the neighborhood, as we walked that streets and we looked at the park, we agreed that, let's give this a detailed study. They provided information, photographs, oral histories. We dug into different primary sources as much as we could, and it was clear that the park was eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. It was listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and now the road will be built, but it'll be built in such a way that it just won't destroy this vital part of the city. But then after that, again, this is why you want to do this work. Once we had worked closely with this neighborhood, the word is out. Well, these guys are good to work with. They listen. They try to help you do what you want to do. So it has led to the recent National Register nomination of the Beck's Knob Cemetery in North Chattanooga, the first cemetery for African Americans. This dates to the Civil War period, would have had some of the so-called contraband laborers buried here, but then it was the primary cemetery for Blacks for the first 40 years after the Civil War, until it was replaced by the next cemetery that we've been working with, the Pleasant Garden Cemetery in Chattanooga. And we're now presently working with a host of groups on the National Register nomination of this cemetery. And again, as part of the process of giving back for these groups sharing this place and sharing its history, we want to give back. We've already held a cemetery preservation workshop there. And, obviously there's much work to be done, but this is a great way for us to help people know just the sort of common sense and non-intrusive steps they can take to repair gravestones, to clear out cemeteries, and to treat these very important places with the respect that they deserve. Dr. Stacy Graham leads all of our cemetery preservation workshops, and she's done many different ones across the state. We find that this is something that so many neighborhoods want. They just want to know how to do the job right, and then they do the job. So too is the story of Rosenwald schools and historic African American schools, and them telling their stories. This is a huge part of our programming, helping alumni groups, neighborhood groups develop school museums in these historic buildings, maybe providing exhibit panels as we did here at the Townsend School Museum in Winchester, Tennessee. That was a project led by Savannah Nees on our staff. And then Emily Huffer, a graduate assistant at MTSU, carried on this project of building out the Townsend Museum as her internship. Again, this is a way that we can fund all of this and help the groups tell their stories the way they want to without incurring expenses. I want them, whatever money they raise, to be put into the building for its preservation. We can always help them with telling their story and building these exhibits, which the neighborhoods and groups across the South really treasure these. These are great places of exchange. We've done driving tours of different historic neighborhoods. This is the Soulsville neighborhood in Memphis. When we brought the group their copies of these, again, they allow us into the neighborhood. My students learn survey, they learn how to write a driving tour. Then we publish those after the community has vetted every inch of it, and then give them the copies, because then they wanted these really to teach, as they said, some of their own neighborhood, the history that's there, and then share that with visitors who might come into this part of Memphis. This is where the Stax Museum is located. So, it does get a sort of high degree of heritage tourism. And this type of product is something we also find that neighborhoods want. In return for the history work, they have a product that they can use in ways that they see best. In Memphis, for the 50th anniversary, in commemoration of the assassination of Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Memphis did several different projects. One was the revitalization of the Universal Life Insurance Company building. And here again, you can see Savannah Nees with members of that, of the architectural firm and descendants of the company executives, city officials. We did an exhibit room for them because, again, they wanted to tell their story. So working with descendants of the company's leaders, local historians, the city, architects, we could come up with something that they found valuable. And of course, then our guys learn immensely from that. And the large photo is Jimmy Tucker, one of the leading architects of the city. And that's Savannah Nees of the Center for Historic Preservation on the right. So what else are we doing in this realm of, again, trying to be of service, of working with communities and for communities and not just studying communities? Well, we now will put graduate students what we call on assignment, working directly on important projects that local groups, neighborhoods, and their nonprofits want done. And the best way to do it is for us to give them skilled labor. So Mandy Hamilton is the person there in the blue shirt on the photo of the left. She's been assisting the Heritage Foundation of Williamson County in the study and the eventual restoration of the Lee Buckner Rosenwald School, the last surviving Rosenwald school in that county. And we've had a long-term alliance that goes back decades with special collections at the Franklin Library of Fisk University, where we have assisted them on many different projects over the years and often have students on assignment there. My feeling is students who want to get into the public history side of archives and libraries, why not work at one of the great national collections, which is the Special Collections of Fisk University. So I treasure that relationship with Fisk. They have been super to allow us to even darken their doors to come in and work with them because they, again, why? Why do they do this? Well, they want to, again, share their stories too. And we try to listen and meet their needs. Cemeteries and church records are now a new goal. Again, I just asked Mary Watkins, who is the woman in the top left photo. She's the head of the Rutherford County African American Heritage Society. What do you need? What can we do? And she said, well, we want help with old churches and particularly old church records. We don't have any money. It was like, well, that's okay. We have money, we have students, and we have expertise. So the end result you can see with is a group of records that have been processed and digitized on Bethel Missionary Baptist Church. We see this as something that's going to be a sort of constant program for us for a long time because the students gain archival experience, they gain experience in digitization, but then the church gets their invaluable records. This church dates back to the 1880s. They get them archived, stored properly, and then digital copies where the originals can be kept and preserved, and they can use those digital copies again as they see fit. So this idea of helping communities do placemaking. I know Mrs. Watkins' group has been doing a great job of putting up historical markers across the county saying, here's this place, it really matters. But then conserving records, I think, are some of the most important work that we're doing right now. That's extended into the Gaylor House project, which is one of the Green Book houses, the one in Franklin that allowed, that African American travelers could spend the night. It's on the left. And then the Matt Gardner farm, I was just working with members of that family Monday and Tuesday as we're doing collections management, helping to come up with restoration planning, working too with the Land Trust of Tennessee. This is a historic family farm still in operation in Giles County, Tennessee, the home of the KKK. So it's wonderful to see how this type of collaboration can help this family keep the farm going and keep it as a landmark in that county. Our next big project is the Merrill Williams Heritage Center in the Natchez Street neighborhood of Franklin. This has just started. This is events from April as the house was being acquired and the restoration is taking place. This will be led by the African American Heritage Society of Williamson County. It'll involve a lot of different people, and we're already learning a ton. And we're providing whatever service this group needs to make this project a reality. So to close, my takeaways are pretty simple. we use this phrase a lot. It's not about you. It's not about your institutional goals, your research. It's about them, what they want to accomplish. We have to stop this thing of researching communities and need to change that to sharing with communities, being of service, creating the opportunities that they want and they see as necessary. We've got to think deep about who is the authority here. We don't see ourselves as the authority in any of these projects. It is the community, the neighborhood, the family farmers. They have the authority. They can tell us what to do, and we'll do it the best that we can. So yeah, white privilege, it's a real problem. But if you set it aside and say, well, actually, it's the privilege is all belonging to the marginalized group, to the silenced group. They're the ones who grant you the privilege of even stepping into their community and hearing their stories. And it's a level of generosity that really our expertise doesn't really match. I mean, what these folks have shared with us is truly invaluable. We try to give back what we can, and then we try to learn from every project that we do. I do think academics and academic institutions can be major contributors to changing narratives and ending silences. But we, as academic institutions, we need to realize what our limitations are and how much we need to learn. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I love to see all the projects that you've been involved in, and I concur. The privilege is ours to be of service, and one way I've been, as a person who works at a historic site, been trying to keep that in mind is I saw somewhere using the term historically excluded instead of underserved, and it really helps shift your thinking as a person, as an academic or as a professional. But Nicole Thomas and Joel Obermeyer both said thank you. Jason Church, his comment in the chat was glad to see you're doing so many great cemetery projects. And thank you for your time. I was going to open up for questions, but it doesn't seem to be any unless anybody had something they wanted to ask. He said, Jason Church said that your takeaways were great. I concur. I would think that those are all things that we should keep in mind as people who work in this field. I appreciate your time and thank you so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Oh yeah, everyone enjoy the conference. It's been great so far.
It has. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye now.
Bye now.